Welcome so much to tap in with us. I'm so happy that you're here because you must be a very special person as you are deciding to use your time and energy on a podcast like this. So today we're going deep within therapeutic astrology, and let me just present who I'm with today because I'm very excited to be with Mark Jones, a fellow therapeutic astrologer and and more than that. So let's just name the books that you've written, Mark, here, that you're the author of Healing the Soul, Pluto, Uranus, and the Lunar Nodes, and then The Soul Speaks, The Therapeutic Potential of Astrology, and latest, the book that I've read up until this interview, The Planetary Nodes and Collective Evolution. So Mark Jones, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is such a pleasure for me, and I'll tell you that I love to interview people. Got a lot of Sagittarius in me, got my Chiron in Gemini in the 11th house, perhaps it's some of that. So I love to interview people, and I've done it for many years in Danish and now in English, and it's always a joy. It's just to be in that humble learning space and exploring, really. But once in a while, I get to interview someone like you. And it's not that you are more than other people, it's just that I have a personal connection to you because I've studied your work and followed you for many years. And I can feel that on my breathing, like I'm overexcited. Because it's such a joy for me to interview someone that had a direct impact on my, well, yeah, my profession as an astrologer, but also it's a way of relating to life, really. So I remember the first time I heard you speak somewhere or somewhere online, and it was about the nodes, the planetary nodes that I think we'll be speaking about today. At least we'll be speaking about this greater reality that we all are in. Um, And at that point, it was just too complicated. It was like too much. So I had to like put it in the background. But then I followed you because of the therapy and the astrology blend that you have. And then now I feel more stable in my astrological basis that I want to go into something like that. The planetary nodes of, in particular, of Jupiter and upwards, onwards. So yeah, first of all, welcome. And maybe you can say something about what it is that you stand for now that I say that I found you, especially from exploring the planetary nodes and, of course, the therapy and astrology.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear you read out what I've written, because if you think about it, the first book is an attempt to find personal meaning, that the personal evolution maybe of the individual in their life, guided by soul or guided by some larger personal energy field. Then I realized, in a sense, how powerful that was and what was happening to people when I talked to them about that. So I directed, even though I was doing the future research of the book you've just read, I delayed that, and I spent time developing that second book, The Therapeutic Potential, so that we could begin to think about the power of astrology to transform people's lives, and not avoid the fact that 20th century psychology had just spent, well, the better part of a century exploring what happens when two people come together in a room or a space in order to try and work out a healing insight or path. So that explains those next few years, that trajectory up until writing that book. And then once I was freed from that imperative, because I felt that as a personal matter of moral conscience, I felt challenged by the depth potential of astrology, and my feeling, frankly, that there was insufficient focus in the community on the therapeutic interface with the client. There was too much emphasis on technique. So you would go to an astrology conference, and of course, remember, between about 2007 and 2019, I'm just at all these big international astrology conferences around the world. So I'm right in the thick of it. So you go to massive conference after massive conference, and not a single person is talking about the human user interface. It's just ever rarer techniques, ever more obscure. You know, we found this ancient text and it has this ancient technique in it, as if astrology is merely a skill set of technical mastery rather than a living transformational tool, the vast majority of which might be an actual psychic, human, soulful exchange between two people, of which the astrological symbolism is a guide, not the be all and end all. So in my readings, in my best readings, let's say a reading is 75 minutes, I spend 10 or 15 minutes on the astrology, and the rest is life and the exchange and what that might mean, what those insights might lead to as a movement, an opening, an insight or healing in the person's life. But then I had this research that had been going on since 2010, 2011. In fact, the original version of Healing the Soul included a whole section on the planetary nodes. And my editor at the time just went, "This is too much. Please do not do this. This has to be something else." Yeah.
My reaction, right? It's
yeah, exactly the same. So clearly it is quite a lot. So I spent then some time, and what had happened was I'd had initial help in just a retreat with a friend and colleague who I run a spiritual psychology coaching training with now, my psychosynthesis.
Kevin.
Yeah, Keith Hackwood it is, and a close friend and a colleague. A very skillful therapist and supervisor, very experienced, and speaks on the international psychosynthesis circuit. He'd come away with me in about 2012 and looked at, do these planetary nodes really work? We even looked at clients of ours charts in a like supervision type space. Does it have like a deeper meaning? Can we even start to intuit what that might mean in individual lives? But by 2016, 2017, I was working with another friend, an astrologer, and he became my researcher, basically. And so we could start looking at enormous amounts of historical charts to back up, because what I didn't want was to reveal this annoying extra thing to the astrology community, yet another weird thing we should look at, right? And just do it on the basis of Mark had an intuition. Hi, guys. I was staring at the stars one day, and I had this intuition, and now I'm going to give you all of this. No, I wanted it to have all this accumulated research, hundreds and hundreds of charts, historical events, individuals. And obviously that took some serious organizing. So it became a much more serious book in some ways. I'll tell you as an aside, that's not the way to have a bestseller necessarily. As a career move, it's fairly, esoteric, shall we say.
Yeah.
But I, again, felt, in this sense, an intellectual conscience. I have criticized overcrowding the chart for years and overcomplicating one's understanding. So who am I to come along and add anything else? So that's why I made it specific to collective evolution, specific to the nodes of Jupiter outwards. And that also neatly avoided a certain technical problem, which is the discrepancy between heliocentric and geocentric positions. Basically, heliocentric being the sun's perspective, where a planetary node basically stays the same for, barely varying at all, just very slowly changing over time. Whereas geocentric nodes can fluctuate through the seasons of the Earth in relationship to the ecliptic. And this complicates things below Jupiter. It means there's enormous variation. And it reaches such an extreme with inner planets that the nodes of Mercury can be on the same degree. So you can have the south node of Mercury and the north node of Mercury on the same degree. So I avoided various technical questions and focused instead on collective evolution. Now, collective evolution is a strange thing, isn't it? But we're not just individual souls, are we, with our individual life evolution, like the first book tried to explore? And some people do seem to embody some sort of collective meaning. Now, remember, with collective meaning and collective evolution, I'm not saying like famous. I'm not saying like just the movers and shakers, and now you can afford to live in the Hollywood Hills or something, or fame and collective meaning are different. This could be someone who lives a relatively quiet life. Just because one focuses, let's say, on a Rosa Parks and an incident on a bus, someone could be having a Rosa Parks type moment in their life and still not be the poster girl for that issue, let's say. Yeah. So collective meaning is different than fame, but collective meaning is about when do individual lives start to embody some aspect of the collective field or memory, both personally, ancestrally, but also in terms of the culture or some sort of larger transpersonal human archetypal field. And then in your very interesting notes for this podcast, and blessings to you for putting some time and thought and energy into it, you know, you mentioned a section of the planetary nodes and collective evolution,
Yeah.
which I just pulled out because you mentioned it,
Yeah.
about you know, the different psychologists of importance in the 20th century. And it was one of my litmus tests. It was like, psychology is one of the 20th century's great contributions, in my view, that maybe hasn't even been properly assimilated or understood even this far into the 21st century. And, you know, the thesis would go something like that. If psychology is part of the collective meaning of the 20th century, then you ought to be able to look at the prominent psychologists and see personal planetary interfaces with those outer planetary nodes. And of course, as soon as you do look at those charts, you do see that. And then you start to see these very interesting patterns. You start to see that Freud, like Einstein, by the way, in a separate field, has Moon on the node of Uranus. And his literal face, the strange old dude with the cigar, literally becomes the face, the moon, the personality of the movement. Lots of people still, to this day, don't think that much past Freud, or, you know, tell me about your mother cliche, or sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, a Hollywood movie producer says, you know, referring to Freud's turning of everything into some sort of sexually suggestive object. So Freud occupied this massive position, but then you see Jung, you know, Venus on the nodes of Pluto, have this other different experience and find this other set of values through the deepening. The man that followed the path of anima within some sort of interior deepening. And by the time of Roberto Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis, the first explicitly spiritual psychology, you have a man whose individual lunar nodes are conjunct the nodes of Neptune. And you start to see these patterns where the interface of personal elements in the chart with these outer planetary nodes may indicate how an individual takes, if you like, a thread from the collective meaning and weaves it into the tapestry of their own life. And to be frank with you, that blew my mind. You know, when I was preparing that research most intensely, I mean, it was over 10, 15 years, the research, but the preparation for the book was what, 2016, 17, 18, 19, gathering it together. And there's so much we left out. But under this stringent test that it should make sense from, it should be recountable from a research perspective, not just some, because otherwise astrology is so prone, isn't it, to spacey intuitions, which are very hard to see how they would apply in different circumstances. That's why I spent so much time applying the idea, you know, to the history of science or the birth of psychology. But once you see these leading figures, embody that collective, you know, what is it? An outer planet crossing the ecliptic at a certain point, a pretty abstract thing. But it can be tracked. It can be tracked how an outer planet crosses the ecliptic, which is the symbol of the zodiac. The constellations are found around the ecliptic. That's the key. You know, the Earth going around the sun around the ecliptic is the whole purpose of astrology. That is where the zodiac is. And people coming along born with a personal planet at the point that that outer planetary cycle weaves around. And then suddenly you find them from a historical overview embodying the very quality that was found in that outer planetary orbit. It's very kind of, and it hints, doesn't it, at a potential for astrology to help the reimagining of certain subjects, including psychology. And I argued recently, I was invited to give a talk at the Royal Albert Hall as part of a charity event created by the London School of Astrology. And I spoke about the birth of modern astrology. But really, the talk was about the interface between psychology and astrology. And I raised the idea, when you realize the extent to which Carl Jung was studying astrology, and when you realize, as I realized in 2012 when I went to the archive in Florence and was shown Roberto Assagioli's astrological papers, when you realize that he was studying it, that he didn't even work with clients in the latter part of his life without their charts, you begin to wonder, has astrology even shaped the course of psychology in a way that psychology does not admit to itself? Has it shaped the very people that created, initially with Carl Jung and I would argue Roberto Assagioli, a meaning-orientated vision of psychology? Were they in fact drawing on astrology as a kind of sacred architecture to even come up with those ideas?
Wow.
And when you're at that point, you realize what this whole secret weirdo thing that we study might have actually, the impact it might have had. And although astrology is enjoying a rise in popularity, it's still kind of that weirdo thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Especially also within therapy and psychology, within that
Yes.
field, for sure. But I recognize what you just said. This is a little commercial for your newsletter, but I recognize what you just said from your recent newsletter, right? With pointing out the ways that astrologists have been, patronized or diminished and ridiculed for some weird reason. But I have so many comments for all of what you just said, Mark. So, but in the beginning, you were talking about the human interface and how astrology have, maybe not really noticed the potential in that. When you say human interface, do you mean what we could call therapeutic resonance?
I do mean that, but I also just mean it on a much more pragmatic level. Let's say you come to me for a chart reading. I'll ask, how can I help today? Immediately, people have to reflect on why they're there and what's involved in their lives. What I'm not doing is picking up your chart and giving you this huge performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I see that such and such is in such and such. Well, you're this kind of person, you know? I'm not playing that game, right? I'm listening to who they are. I'm trusting that the gesture of their being towards wholeness could be supported by me, both energetically and in my interpretation of the chart. And because I think the great mystery of astrology, once you've learned the technique to a certain level, the great skill is linking that technique to life and not remaining in an abstract symbolic domain. And the key to that is to listen to people's real lives. And then they start to show you how their chart operates. And it's a lot of Rudhyar's ideas, really, that began to shape this. I mean, Rudhyar just makes the hugely practical point that you don't see people emphasize, that people treat your chart like it's an eternal realm. They treat your chart like it's timeless, whereas actually it's not. You've lived it for X number of years. You know, I've lived my chart for 53 years. Therefore, my chart has been saturated by my life process, and that has to be understood or has been changed, or my understanding of its potential has grown. We have to remove it out of the abstract, trusting that that deeper meaning still remains, and tie it into the intimate issues of people's lives.
As you were mentioning Dane Rudhyar there, and so it's a blend of Dane Rudhyar and Jeffrey Wolfgreen. That I mean, you have many inspirations, and I love that in your books. I love the way that you write, that you keep quoting people, because it's just really, I love that kind of writing. So, but is that correct that those are two like ground?
I think I would say yes. Astrologically, it's tracing some of the roots of Green's thinking, and I studied in person with Green in London in 1999. Back to its origins, many of its origins, the proto form of Green's thinking is in Rudhyar, and going back and clarifying that helped me develop my own relationship to that body of thought. And then, of course, it's been influenced by my spiritual psychology training, and the fact that quietly I'm critiquing the whole astrological model on one level, that I'm saying this whole, I perform your chart for you for X amount of time and you don't say anything, or I send you a recording, or I expect you to just sit there quietly and not interrupt me with your actual life, is problematic to me from a psychotherapeutic standpoint. And so I am, so Rudhyar, Green, big influences on my method, but also the psychological astrologers, you know, Liz Green, Stephen Arayo, Howard Sportas. So a fusion of that kind of quality psychological astrology with the evolutionary astrology and the, you know, I think Rudhyar being the kind of father of modern spiritual psychological astrology. And of course, it turns out then he has a personal relationship with Roberto Assagioli, and they're studying together in Florence before Mussolini shuts down the Psychosynthesis Institute. So in a world, you know, without the rise of fascism in Central Europe, who knows what would have happened? Assagioli lost so much during the war, including his family home and including all his papers. So, you know, just prior to the Second World War, there's all these meetings. Rudhyar is traveling across Europe, studying with Assagioli. He's just read all of Jung up until that point. This is around the time of Astrology of Personality in 1936. So I feel I'm, in another sense, going back to that pre-Second World War, everything that's going on at that time, and being open to all of it in a way that, if it had been a more peaceful, creative world, might have happened at the time. But really, the great alchemy for me at this point is bringing the astrology into the therapeutic dynamically, not just adding a psychological overlay to one's astrological insights, but changing the actual structure of the way astrology is applied.
Yeah, yeah. I'm joining you on in that project for sure. I feel it's what you're saying here is an old way of doing it, but I realize that there's a whole culture. I mean, not only for astrologers, but also for people seeking out astrologers that are in the midst of being changed as we speak, because you see that from the expectations that clients have when they come, right? And then you just have to figure out a way where can we both, you know, be here. You kind of get some of what you expected, but also I'm doing it in a certain way.
Yes.
And so for right now, so this is something that I love to talk to people about who calls themselves therapeutic astrologers or psychological astrologers, something like that. How do you actually do it? And you just told me how you're doing it. There, I see there are different ways. For me right now, I'm sharing it. I'm dividing it into an astrology session and a therapy session. So that's how I do it. But always in therapy, I have people's charts in the back of my mind. And in an astrology reading, I'll always work with it therapeutically because it doesn't make sense, you know, otherwise.
Exactly.
So
brilliantly put. So you've trained in both then. I mean, tell me about yourself, or how did you get into these things in that sense?
I left the religion. I think that's that's my main turning point. There's been many turning points. I have my son in the 8th house, so a lot of transformation in my life, and so after I left the religion that I grew up in, I I sought out astrology. It was one of the things that you're not supposed to look into, and I looked into it, and I couldn't look back. So I started there, and then when I found therapy, I'm still studying. I'm a NAM therapist, and I have different courses, but I'm studying to become a psychotherapist at the moment. And that it seems like the missing link for everything, because even though astrology was like blowing my mind, like opening everything up, and like wow, recognizing myself again and again, that didn't give me the key to actually changing anything, because realizing it was not enough for me. So I had to go through that whole therapeutic immersion of understanding, oh, okay, there's something called an identity. It's based on some kind of protective system that you have, all of these ideas. and ways of working with yourself, that has just helped me immensely and helped me help others much more than when I didn't have that piece.
That's what you realize, isn't it? That's the initiation when you study that kind of material. And you realize, to just be blunt with you, that astrology is not enough for
Yeah.
genuine transformation and healing. Astrological insight alone, it's a useful pointer, it's a useful map, but it's not enough on its own.
Mhm.
And, you know, whilst we could see the material in the Planetary Nodes book that pointed to the 2020 crisis, my researcher and I could see that in 2016. You know, I spoke about it even in various talks, 2018 at UAC. You could see the Saturn Pluto coming in 2020, but of course, it has this huge impact on the world. And I find myself during COVID creating a spiritual psychology coaching training
Mm.
and working with people to develop that, not just vision of psychology and the identity, but how that interfaces with a psycho-spiritual insight as to the nature of a personal path in this life. And that becomes so rewarding. So it's funny, I published this would it be fair to say, am I blowing my own horn trumpet too much to say, this most technical book with some visionary elements in it? I published that just at the time the world has transitioned. I'm working with people all around the world to help them with the shock of what's going on. And I switched to a spiritual psychology coaching training and creating 100+ hours of video training content that isn't even astrology. I mean, it might use astrological symbols as illustrations at some points, but it's literally a vision of psychology from the ground up, literally from Freud and Jung, into an energetic model of the human psyche that acknowledges people's creative and spiritual potential, as well as their early survival adaptive personality structures.
Mhm.
And that's been incredibly rewarding. And of course, that has helped me develop even more of an intense shorthand to share with people, even in the one-off reading consultation space. Therapeutic ideas in short form, intense bursts that are relevant to the person and their development. And then they have options to look into them. I can recommend literature, even my own teaching material that covers those topics. It's becoming this very rich way of working where I'm no longer a therapist, which I was for 15, 16 years in the city of Bristol. You know, what's the point of having a UK license when most of my clients are around the world?
Right.
And I'm not an out-and-out therapist anymore because astrology is front and center. But also, I'm not so much doing the holding type therapy as making the assumption that the people I'm working with are of a certain creative agency. And therefore, certain educational things, certain teaching content or whatever can accelerate the process, just like their understanding of their own natal chart can accelerate the process of transformation. And so it's become, hence calling it, at least one of the reasons for calling it, a spiritual psychology coaching training. It's akin to a kind of therapeutic coaching. It's assuming, you know, it wouldn't work in certain clinical situations. It wouldn't work if people are carrying a certain level of damage that I might have worked with in the past as a therapist in a city. But people attracted to my work through books, talks, various things, and then working with them, assuming that their own creative autonomous self can be part of the process and encouraging that creative autonomy, being a cheerleader for it effectively, like,
Mm.
you know. And then I'm working with these really interesting, creative, you know, very developed people at times and just encouraging them to continue that integration.
Mm. It is a life goal of mine to take that specific training you're talking about.
Yes,
I also saw that in a newsletter because I'm not
yes.
sure your website is entirely updated.
No. Well, and it's because in a way, we're encouraging people to contact me directly about that training and just to have a chat or check where people are at, that it's suitable,
Mm.
and do it like that rather than just have people sign up, as it were. But yes, there perhaps could do with some structural update on that front, but that's kind of why. So it becomes
No, that's
more of a
good.
kind of gentle, not quite interview, but gentle get to know each other process in becoming a part of it, if you like.
I hear you because you're also saying that it's sort of next level and you have had some schooling before in these kind of ideas.
Yeah, or just be ready in yourself, in your life, to be in the right space for that kind of, you know, it's designed in a sense to produce a transformation in people, a psycho-spiritual transformation. It's designed to act as a subtle vessel for a couple of years around a deeper step in your inner centering, so that the nature of the subsequent or future work that you do comes from that deeper
Sounds
orientation. Yeah.
yeah, really amazing. I'm signed up to like 3 different therapy schools here from September. So I'm like not doing it this year, but next year maybe. If you, I don't know if you have it every year. Do you have it every year?
I don't know what format it will be.
No.
Certainly this is the second time. We were in the archive in Italy with my friend and colleague Keith, who I taught it with. I teach the teaching material and he does the small group work.
Nice.
And then we bring it all together. And we were with 4 students from the course, 3 from North America and 1 from Italy, in the archive in Florence. And there was just such a good response from the volunteers and the trainers there. I mean, literally a kind of, please do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'll just continue to follow that. The challenge for me, as I'm sure you can imagine, is just world enough and time. You know, just this material, we have enough for a second book, right? On the personal, the inner planetary nodes.
Right.
But it's just that would take such an extraordinary thing to bring that together at the same level of quality for such a relatively small audience, if you like, not to be, but the slightly more developmental, isn't it, area of astrology. I'm very hopeful, and certainly you contacting me and the wonderfully thoughtful questions you raised in your email made me think, hopefully this is a long-standing thing that people will be looking at, maybe the way I looked at psychology in years to come, and seeing the astrological link to those points.
I mean, you really have to remember that. I also heard you were mentioning it, that it might not be a bestseller or something, but to me, I couldn't care less. It's once you vibe with your vibration and with your teachings, then I'm like, I'm just having all of the books. So when I got this, I guess that was in 2020 then, um I wasn't ready either. you know it took a few years before I started actually being able to digest some of this. um and that's what I love about your books, that it's not just, oh, now I've read this, moving on. It's like going back to it again and again and again. I love that. This is really valuable, this one, because there are different charts of, yeah, famous people, people that we know about, otherwise we can read about them. We don't know them already. And um and, and the chart analysis of those, and also the soul speaks. It's where, Pluto in the first house, have all of these ideas around what that could be for a person. It's so valuable when you're learning astrology. It really is. So there's no doubt in my mind that this is something that you'll circle back on.
No, I appreciate you saying it. And I do write my books, and I create my more intensive content for the masterclasses and, say, the psychosynthesis training and other trainings in a way that is dense enough and highly curated enough that it tries to distill something so that it would be worthy of repeat engagement. I do, in my own small way, take a stand against, what do we call it, like the regurgitated endless content machine of the world. And yet I enjoy some of that too. But I come from that older era, don't I? Where I grew up without that world, where certain books changed my life, from Lord of the Rings to, when I was a kid, to later stuff.
Yeah.
But this therapeutic point, right?
Mm.
And it's healing the soul that does that Pluto breakdown, and it's the soul speaks that tries to, look at certain therapeutic paradigms like mirror transference or idealizing transference in therapy and work out what they're doing.
Yeah.
But that interchange between the depth way of looking at astrology, examining the potential of a planet like Pluto, or examining the potential of the meaning of the nodes, and holding that at a deep level, and then having space for looking at all the different ways identity might configure around those different challenges. This is, to me, entering a very interesting sort of third space, which you're hinting at in your work. At the moment, you keep them sort of separate, but because what, you know, the astrology includes a therapeutic perspective and the therapy includes the chart as a background influence. You're
Sure.
beginning to move towards that third point. The third point is we're in an autonomous space together. Two people have chosen to come together around the theme of healing and transformation, and the astrology and psychology and various even other subtle things in our being, you know, two souls meeting,
Mm.
are all coming together into the space and informing the organic process of a deeper response in people to the nature of the space. And I think there is a future in that. And to go back to a point of yours, sometimes, you know, some of the world of astrology is open to that. Certainly, the world of astrology is open to psychology, at least partially.
Mm.
Whether it's open to true psychotherapeutic technique or expression is a different question, but at least it has some openness. And there are many psychologists and psychotherapists who are interested in astrology, but formally, within the psychological community at large, with its licensing issues and its attempt to position itself within a mainstream materialist culture or scientific materialist culture, there is very little openness. It is seen as kooky, to
Yeah.
say the least. And that's a real shame because it's a kind of block. I mean, I think there are increasingly, certainly I was involved, some of my work made its way into a doctoral thesis in the West Coast. Places like Pacifica and California Institute are increasingly, in California, increasingly producing people who have done PhD theses where astrology is included within the therapeutic work. So that is happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it would be wonderfully exciting, wouldn't it, if the world of psychology became a touch more open-minded in a way that the very people that created the world of psychology originally were often very open-minded.
True. Yeah. But interesting, just when you said that psychologists or psychotherapists are now struggling to get into, being equal to science, or
Yes.
so it's kind of understandable that you don't want to be related to something that people don't consider to be scientific and cannot, per definition, be completely scientific because it's not able, you're not able to repeat it in a scientific way. A lot of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
But then the hard science of repeatable evidence and, you know, the STEM subjects, engineering, math, science subjects, which are so important to our culture, from civil engineering projects all the way to technology, you know, keyhole heart surgery or various things, just these incredible advancements. But there's a distinction, isn't there, between almost that hard, pure science and a kind of scientificness, a much more loose term, a kind of unconscious series of assumptions about materialism, a kind of existentialism, bordering on nihilism, the kind of, you know, we're floating on a rock 10,000 miles an hour through space for no reason. You know, the Big Bang just happened. It's an accident. Consciousness is an accident in the brain, what they call an epiphenomenon. With that background, you get this kind of thought form, this miasma of thinking that goes, anything that's more meaningful than that, the soul, the angelic, you know, love seeing people's psychic energy cross through space and time, you know, the son who drowns in a naval accident, who shows up at the point of his death on the edge of the mother's bed, dripping with water, even though she lives 5,000 miles away, saying, I love you, before he disappears. All of that world is reduced to strange magazines you get in occult and weird looking bookstores, even though there's overwhelming human evidence, if you like, because it's outside of that paradigm. Just like you said, it's outside of people like Karl Popper's and others, you know, test for the durability of science, that you could just repeat it, you know, that copper, when you burn it in a flame, burns greeny blue or whatever, you know, that these things that can be done anywhere. That can be done in Brisbane, that can be done in Copenhagen, that can be done in London, whatever.
Yeah. I guess I just had a moment of sympathy for psychology and and
Yeah.
struggle to get accepted as a human need to be viewed to what you can call work with yourself and to have had that space held for an essential part of you, your psyche, who you are, more than just your material body, right? Don't, it's not just, oh, my back hurts. There might be more to it. So that whole struggle of realizing all of who we are, but then as you speak, I'm realizing, yeah, okay, it has tremendous right now consequences that psychology is not open to any alternative approach, because people get medicated, and uh, a lot of things are ignored. Um,
Well,
and
it's worse than that, isn't it? As soon as you're medicated in that certain way, your symptom, your suffering, the fact that you can't sleep at night, you keep waking up in the night in cold sweats, and you lie there for 3 hours anxious, and you're depressed the next day. Take these pills, so it just zonks you out.
mm,
You never get to engage with the meaning of those symptoms. The fact that some other part of you was trying to reach out to you in your blankness, in your struggles, in your maybe a slightly dead spot you come to in your life, another part of you is reaching out. No, we live in a world, your back pain problem, if you take the work of John Sarno, like healing back pain, and the fact that certain figures in the world have pointed to the fact there might be underlying stress causes. Some doctors, I had a friend who was in this field, right? Pain relief, he's a physiotherapist, and
mm,
he's trying to set up a pain clinic, and he was into the John Sarno work, the hidden causes of stress and back pain. And he would talk at conferences, and doctors would ridicule him
mm,
for even making a link between stress in the person's life and their back pain.
mm,
It was an entirely like just organic spinal material issue to these people. So many of these people can't cope with even one subtle step towards that level. Never mind, complex multidimensional self holds many soul memories, ancestral systemic memories, has many individual complex challenges. The loss of soul in the world on a deeper level is profound, and you could argue is a crucial part of the current sort of crisis or malaise in the world, or the feeling of anxiety on a collective level in the world.
yeah.
But we are living in a world where, in its most ruinously narrow form, the scientific ideal becomes a narrow puritanism that shuts out any kind of questioning around more subtle aspects of the condition.
Mm. Yeah, I just feel like sharing. This is what I do when I'm free right now. I'm a social worker with addict abuse for drug abuse, people who have left a drug abuse, and um, and the problem with that is always when they also are qualified or seen as having a psychological issue, then the psychiatric ward won't treat them until the drug abuse is off, and then they come to someone like us, and they just have a lot of medication they need to take because of the psychological problems. But then that medicine can, it's like blurring them or slowing them down, or it's difficult to work therapeutically in that mix when we have to like divide things up. You're not staying
Oh,
nerve.
I mean, antipsychotic medication
Yeah.
can change people's metabolism and an entire almost physical shape within a year or 2 years of taking it. People will literally, there are such serious and significant metabolic alterations. Even SSRIs, common antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, change people's metabolism. So you can have some young kid who's depressed, feeling anxious, feeling socially unpopular. They get medicated, changes their metabolism. 5 years later, they're slightly less depressed in the anxious way, but now they are, 20 kilograms overweight or 15 kilograms overweight from the metabolic changes partly induced by the medication. So now they have a different set of social constraints or anxieties. So The medication problem is severe. Also, in all my work as a therapist in a city during about 2003 and 2016, every time a client had depression or anxiety, and then they were given a medication and they went back to the doctor and said, I still have the depression and anxiety, the doctor gave them more of the medication
Yeah.
or gave them another medication on top of the existing medication. They never stopped one. They hardly ever withdrew or stopped them. So, so what's happened to our humility, right? You know, there have been famous books about these things. Professor Irving Kirsch wrote some brilliant analysis of just how little we know about the different way antidepressant drugs work and how they're not operating at a much higher factor than the placebo. And yet, when they don't immediately cure depression, when citalopram doesn't immediately work, or Wellbutrin, or whatever it is, right? When they don't immediately work, you should carry on taking them, just add something else. I mean, I would argue you've seen this in recent health pandemics. There's no real insight. There's just this one thing for all, and then if it's not working, throw something else at it. People are different, their circumstances are different, their physiology and body-mind interface are different.
Yeah.
It's a lack of humility too. I gave you this thing, it didn't work. Okay, maybe you should stop taking it and let's try something else.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it has serious consequences for people, the way that we think about that today. I'm conscious about our time.
Yes.
And I wanna ask you about, yeah, this it's a little long question. I sent you the notes, you referred to them a few times. Um, but it's to we're talking about in in your books and in your work this energy field, and I'm
Yes.
trying to decipher if you're talking about two different things. Can I just quote you from
Yes.
Healing the Soul? Is am I confusing what book it's from? No,
I'm
it
not
is.
sure yet because I haven't heard the
Okay.
quote, but yeah.
Right. Okay. So at least it's one of the former books where you say the natal chart is the symbolic expression of the infinite field as it has been translated into human form. And then in the latest book, for example, you say something like it is this part of the energy field that corresponds to what I call soul memory,
Yes.
that this term implies already existing material, and that the birth chart is the ultimate symbol of that reality.
Yes.
So my question is, if it's, are you talking about the same energy field, or are you talking about something different?
Well, fields are complex, aren't they? And they can operate on different levels. So, but let's make a simple point to begin with. What I am saying is that soul is not just some orientation, not just some way of seeing the world, not just, hey, it was soulful, man, you know? But soul is an actual subtle radiance,
Mm.
like your subtle body or your auric field. That psychosynthesis is based on an energetic model, from my perspective. People use a Saggioli's egg diagram, which is based on the higher unconscious, the middle unconscious, the lower unconscious, ensouled, right? They use that in different ways, but I am saying, as I said in the archive in 2012 to the lady showing us around, you know, and I'd just come from the San Marco, the frescoes that included all these incredible halo auras around Christ and the disciples in the San Marco, just down the road from Roberto Saggioli's house in Florence. And she said that he used to like to sit and meditate there. It is an auric field, just like certain halos and auric fields in certain early paintings show the spiritual aura of the people being represented. In that world, what you're saying is that the transpersonal psychology is attempting to refer to this subtle, admittedly subtle compared to the table kind of domain, but still real. And in fact, arguably more real in terms of its dynamism in your experience than seemingly solid things, right? So that's the one field, the personal field. Then the personal field has layers. For example, the difference between your conscious memories, say like your earliest childhood memories, or how you got on with your parents or your siblings, or what school you went to. But there are memories that people uncover in hypnosis of much earlier things that they couldn't remember before, or even the birth process. They might relive the birth process in some way. And then, of course, people have transpersonal memories, past life memories, whatever it is. So instead of literalizing reincarnation and making it a kind of, in order to explore this territory, you have to have the view of reincarnation that I have or something, I coined the term soul memory because it's clear that people are coming in with structured memories. Now, what is the chart? Does every chart look the same? No. People's charts look different. The natal chart is a living symbol that you are not a tabula rasa, a blank slate. It's a living symbol that the blank slate paradigm is a fantasy, largely. And I would argue it is in other ways too. And it's actually quite a dangerous idea to ascribe this blank slate to people because it fails to recognize the psychological developmental heritage from the family, the ancestral systemic heritage, the socio-cultural, political, religious heritage, etc., etc., etc. So soul memory is the deeper part of this personal field. Now, the personal field on the non-deep part, you could say, is the vibe you get from people. You sit down on a sofa in a waiting room, you get this really good vibe from someone. You sit down in a therapeutic space, you get this good vibe from someone. You sit down in a different space, you're in a restaurant, you're with your friend, you go, can we move? Oh, I don't like this table. And you make up some excuse like it's too bright or the air conditioning's too close. But actually it's because you don't like the vibe. You sat next to someone just seems edgy or just not in the wrong space. This is picking up people's energy field. Mm-hmm. But the soul memories are contained in deeper, subtle layers within that energy field. Mm. And then we could say, in certain more surrendered states of consciousness, you enter through the personal energy field into transpersonal domains. Ancestral or systemic insights, karmic insights, and then experiences of surrender to the presence. And the presence, would have a sacred quality, but also would have a quality of being effectively the infinite field of reality itself. Mm. So we could say there are layers within layers. There is one ultimate field, and then there are the localized expressions of that field taking different forms at different levels, being stepped down like a transformer process. And I think that is a very interesting kind of resonant metaphor for the human condition, spiritually speaking. But it's also a clear indicator of what the natal chart is at its best. It is a map of the electromagnetic potential contained within that field. Once you start looking at the natal chart like that, very powerful intuitions, in my experience, come to one as a person. Because you're seeing that. Because remember, the natal chart isn't wedded to you like some unique thing, right? In a sense, it is a space-time moment. Mm. It is just a symbolic map of the planets at that space-time moment. Someone could have opened a hospital, a bottle of champagne against a ship, or a blackbird may have been born, or a rat even in the hospital basement.
Yeah, but I'm hearing that when you say that, that's okay. We have to be aware of what level are people born and what is it that
exactly. Yes, because the blackbird has your chart born at the same time in the same place. So I'm just trying to break people's unique idea they were kind of given this chart by some it's a space-time moment, but you make it your own by the impact of your living psychic stream, the reality of your psychic being hitting that chart and animating it, if you like, because it's the symbol of the origin moment where you arrived in this domain.
Okay, so your living stream,
yeah,
plus then what you call the collective significance, what you started in this conversation to explain a little bit about.
So that is a slightly different dimension. So the personal psychic stream you look at with the material and the healing, the soul, lunar nodes conditioned by certain other qualities. And then, of course, planets squaring the lunar nodes, the lunar nodal rulers, various conditions. The collective significance was a different dimension. It was the intuition that looking at certain phenomena and being open to the fact that other planets had nodes. So why the moon's nodes for personal significance? Because the moon is the symbol, the family, the mother, the hearth, where you developed in safety a kind of personal self, right? And then it's that personal self moving through time, the movement of the moon's orbit creating the nodal axis.
Mhm.
Well, how do you apply that to Jupiter? It would have to be the evolution of a collective series of beliefs, wouldn't it? Or how do you apply that to Pluto or Saturn? Deep unconscious structures in the psyche of humanity changing over time.
Mm.
So that becomes this way that astrology might open even to this more subtle imagining of the collective field. Now, obviously, it's harder to go as far as clearly in that area because you don't have the same degree of personal information, but it's still very rich and interesting. And, the idea presented in the Planetary Nodes, which I've since developed further, primarily in a series of classes in Beijing with a large Chinese student base, was this idea of, but also I've taught in Australia and will be doing a webinar for Astrology University later in the year that will include this as well, is that when you look at these patterns, they are themselves subtly changing. So at the time of Christ, the nodes of Neptune, which have since moved, were in Cancer Capricorn, just like the nodes of Pluto are now. So in 2000 years, the nodes of Neptune have moved to Leo Aquarius, and the nodes of Pluto in that 2000 years have come to the point that the nodes of Neptune were. So you have the nodes of Neptune, and you have Christianity and its impact on Greco-Roman culture, and indeed the evolution of Western civilization. And now, in an era where you could argue we're at the end, we're entering the post-religious age, or at this point where Christianity is no longer the cultural force that it was in Western civilization, you suddenly have Pluto and Saturn's nodes, but Pluto's exactly where Neptune's were at the time of the life of Christ.
Right. I thank you for slowing it down like that. That's it. Appreciate it. But I get it when yeah. If you talk quickly about it, I'm gonna lose it. It's like, oh, too many things. But that makes a lot of sense. It's the same point where the nodes of Neptune were. That's the
Yes.
Pluto Saturn, and
So what's the symbolism of that? The nodes of Neptune are there when it's the original spiritual impulse, right? This original outpouring that leads this almost revolutionary clique within Roman society, secret meetings, the Christian, revolution, if you like. Then it grows and becomes the absolute behemoth of our civilization. Then it goes through various forms, the Reformation, etc. But mere, decades after Nietzsche declares the death of God, you see the rise of totalitarianism around the discovery of Pluto time. And by the late 20th century, you have Pluto on the same point that Neptune was on. Pluto, the great sort of destroyer, transformer, on the same point of the original spiritual impulse of Christianity. And in most countries in Europe, you'd have to say, there was a recent poll here in the UK, the BBC a few years ago found that, for the first time, less than 50% of the country identified as Christian, or in other countries in Europe, I'm sure it's less than that at some point. Christianity is not the force that it was. And part of the current challenges we face as a collective, you could argue, are linked to that, are linked to the loss of a religiously encoded level of meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that Christianity was right in that religiously encoded level of meaning. And certainly some of the forms it had taken socially towards the end of its expression were very limiting and restrictive. Contrast the Sermon on the Mount to certain narrow puritanical sects of Christianity. They're quite different. But you can't also just make up a new religion. It's not an easy thing to do, is it? It points to a genuine psychological and spiritual crisis in the evolution of Western democracies.
right. So
in
that's
my view. Yeah.
that it points to that spiritual crisis. Because what you were just saying, I felt like that's the question that is really difficult to answer when we start with this collective significance. Is like what was supposed to happen versus what did happen. Like what this person had a significant role, let's say, and the way that I understood you, as you explained, like being a representative of something collective, right? Where it's so one could get famous for it if it was noticed, and maybe not, but it was the person picked something up as representation of what is going on in all of our collective field, right?
Yes.
So, but then trying to understand like why, or was it right or not right, then that's it's like another level of trying to figure it out.
Well, and that's where we have to acknowledge that as a subjective individual human, we will never know certain things like that. There has to be a radical humility, both in the face of the complexity. An individual human can never understand all the different threads that would make up collective evolution. So it's a humility in the face of the complexity, but also a humility in the face of the mystery. You can't know everything. You can't know why things were exactly. But certainly tracing these planetary nodes of Jupiter outwards starts to give you this sense that you're looking at some of the behind the scenes, what the stage manager would have been doing in the theater, and the lighting crew, and the people with the trapdoor in a theater stage. You start to feel like you're not just watching the show, you're looking at how people are how it's being created. And
Yeah.
that is phenomenally powerful at its best. I mean, there were several moments creating that material where it was like entering some sort of Raiders of the Lost Ark, finding the secret, treasure kind of moments or something. When I was studying Alan Turing as an example, an individual example of one sensitive point and just how often it was hit in his life, when I was looking at some of those psychologists' chart, when I really just mapped out, we created in these huge black scrapbooks, these maps of charts, right? And you just look at all those psychologists and just the weird way they've got these points touching those points, and how much sense it makes when you start to look at the contribution they made to the field.
Yeah.
Even someone like Adler with his inferiority complex, Mercury on the node of Neptune, and he was bullied by his siblings, and he felt this victimized sensitivity to the whole power dynamic, and then built his whole psychology on that power dynamic. His siblings, Mercury on the node of Neptune, and then the sensitivity to it to see how that would shape people creatively. And you realize that we don't, however inspirational a person's ideas are, they don't transcend that personal self, do they? They don't transcend that chart fully. They are still an expression of it.
For
Just
sure.
like, yeah, just like me, just like my work is
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That is what is so mind blowing. I feel I see that again and again where this is now you're using the notes, but just in general with astrology, where it's like those ideas the ideas that you've written about is exactly what is said in the chart, at least at some level.
Yes. Yes.
It's amazing.
Well, and you notice that people like Dane Rudhyar, Grant Louis, and various others that wrote about the planetary nodes, just like I have planetary node conjunctions. I
Mm.
have two. I have Moon Venus on the node of Pluto, and I have Mars on the node of Uranus. And it's like, it's all, even that, isn't it? Of course you explore the thing that was also personally interesting to you. It's
Yeah.
it's the nature of the human deal, isn't it? You have
Yeah.
to learn to follow your passion, your joy, but hopefully within it be clear enough to make some contribution to something beyond yourself as well.
Yeah. Okay. That's I feel that is linking to a question that I wanted to get to about the spiritual impulse to sing the song of oneself
Yes,
and that's something you say in where the nodes of Neptune is now
yes.
in Leo.
Just in the 11th century, it changed from South Node Capricorn, North Node Cancer to South Node Aquarius, North Node Leo, and has been steadily moving from that point. It is around between about 8 and 10 geocentrically Leo Aquarius now. So the North Node of Neptune since the 11th going into 12th century has been in Leo. And you see, don't you, in the sort of project of the West, this attempt to make sense of the sacred individual idea, the archetype of following a path of individuality. It hasn't even existed in other cultures necessarily in quite the same way. And as part of that, you can't help but feel, yes, like the Whitman idea, Walt Whitman, you know, the song of myself, leaves of grass, you know, can I find the inner hymn to the creation inside me, the unique contribution I might make to what you could call the sacred choir of reality if you had the ears to hear it, you know, the beauty of nature, the power and mystery of love, the power, light, and wisdom of the soul, if we were open to it. I think it's a brilliant way of looking at those nodes of Neptune. And then from a healing point of view, south node of Neptune is in Aquarius since the 11th, 12th century. In, you know, Aquarius is a symbol of many, many things, right? But, you know, a kind of collective humanity. But then North Node Leo, you need to be singing your individual song so that the collective humanity has your unique contribution to help it. But also in the work I did years ago in Healing the Soul, and partly following on from Jeffrey Green's out of print work on Uranus at the time, a book called Freedom from the Known, I argued that Uranus has this kind of deep memory aspect to it. It's the higher octave of Mercury. And in that deep memory, it has a correspondence to an aspect of the soul memory, the mental remembering aspect. And therefore, you could see in challenging signatures within it that the memory might have challenging experiences embedded in the memory. And you could link that to a kind of subtle trauma, you know, awareness of ancestral, historical, systemic, or karmic trauma. Now, I might frame it slightly, you know, clearly trauma studies have come a long way from then. And I'd have to distinguish this from what we might call overt trauma that is obviously real in people's lives, you know, violent attack, war, domestic violence, etc. This would be subtle memories. And we can see that healing is increasingly about, in my view, acknowledging what is in people's subtle fields and the memories and the repressed experiences and traumas that are contained there, alongside, obviously, certain overt traumas in people's lives, which might have to be dealt with in a different way. But what you also increasingly see in this world is that people are traumatized without necessarily particularly overt trauma having taken place. And there's a great anxiety and sensitivity to that field in the world.
And so one school of thought is concluding that is developmental trauma. Because
that is clearly key. I mean, you can use that word trauma, but then trauma begins to get so overused, it becomes difficult to distinguish what's being referred to. But developmental stress, the developmental challenge is crucial, right? And people make this assumption that, you know, because you age biologically, you grow up, but you don't necessarily. It is a psychic victory to truly mature through the developmental challenges. It is a much more challenging enterprise than most regular people give credit to. So I do think the developmental issue is crucial. And in the spiritual psychology coaching training and lots of my work in that area, I have developed a whole approach to the developmental challenges to try and cut through some of the therapeutic specialized language and complexity and bring it back to its emotional psychic core. What I call the mammalian loyalty project.
Right.
You know, the soul comes in, but it has to anchor as this tiny little, you know, very small children are like baby otters or something. You know, you're just trying to keep them alive with milk and warmth and wash them occasionally and hold them, you know. You're coming in through this very tiny, sensitive creature, and you have to make this gamble of this loyalty with these figures. And in all too many cases, those figures are already sufficiently challenged by life beforehand, or have failed to go through their own developmental process, etc. And then, boom, there are problems in the bond. But the child can't escape the bond. It's the whole way we come in. So the developmental process is absolutely crucial, I would argue. And it's an implication in healing the soul. You could say that early childhood, the source of the developmental challenge, is the repository of soul memory, karmic memory. You know, because that is the expression. We don't choose our schools, we don't choose our clothes, our house, we don't choose what our parents do for a living. They make these choices. It becomes the expression of our karmic background.
That's absolutely how I see it. And I liked that just furthered view, that widened view, that it was not only just childhood, but soul's childhood.
Yes, exactly. And soul memories coming into childhood. So the soul has memories, let's say, of various, war-torn or environmental destruction, forced migration experiences, and it has become separated from family and multiple of those. And then the child is more sensitive to the fact that one of the parents works away all the time, or that they keep moving house because of the father's job in the military or whatever it is. The child with those set of soul memories is more sensitive to those shifts, thinking each time, because the way the memories shape, the very subtle memories shape even the background experience of the developmental process.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to comment on something you said before, and I know our time is short now. Yeah, it's because we're talking about the nodes of Neptune, and how you say it like this, how life wants to express itself creatively, and each form strive to fulfill its archetypal blueprint. And that is something that I have a lot of fire in me, and that's something that I really like. I feel that. I feel that
Yes.
there is something in particular that we are here to do. But then also, I know you also talk about non-duality, and I believe it's in this one. Um, and it's something that we've had on here in the podcast a lot. And I'm certainly struggling exactly integrating those two perspectives. Like one is leaning back, even just allowing life. And the other one is you're here to do something, something in
Well,
particular.
and I think that's an archetypal challenge, and I wouldn't want to see one side favored too much over the other. I mean, I'll say this about non-dual teaching. I'll be contentious, even though we don't have time to talk about it too much. I mean, there are certain ideas from Buddhism and other related teachings that become slightly problematic to many Westerners, it seems to me. Is Buddhism an authentic path? Yes, clearly. Is Mahayana Buddhism, arguably one of the purest traditions ever? Yes. Is the Western psyche that wasn't brought up in that tradition, ready for emptiness, as it were, or Dharmakaya? That's a much more complex question, and there are views even within the Tibetan Buddhist approach. The whole point of Vajrayana is that you do deity practice, so that, because they're saying you as a personal self would struggle to deal with ultimate reality, but if you arise as this beautiful god or goddess, or even this wrathful, powerful deity, you're going to be able to contemplate that ultimate state much more easily as this being. So they're even acknowledging in that, the crisis from a relative perspective of ultimate reality. But I would argue it's a false construct at that level. It's a confusion of levels. You becoming a sufficiently empowered person to find your way and follow your inner fire is no comment on non-duality or not. Non-duality is so big, it easily encompasses duality. The nature of truth is so vast. The nature of the presence is so vast and so flexible and compassionate, you could say, in one way of looking at it. But certainly, and I think, by the way, the diamond approach, certainly the writings of Hamid Ali, or A.H. Almas, as he's called in his books, they point, you have this personal diamond, you develop this personal diamond or this personal essence, and then the personal essence can realize the light that is the background that shines through the diamond. But you have to have realized that diamond. The danger of the passive approach in the face of ultimate reality is that people don't become dynamic enough in their own psychological and creative processes to develop sufficiently. You have to be someone to give that up in the face of ultimate reality. You have to have gotten somewhere. Otherwise, it's too much like passivity or a kind of apathy, depression on a subtle level. It's too much like a kind of just giving up. There's no point being a self because of the reality of an Atman or emptiness or whatever. To
Yeah.
me, this is an entirely psychologically like a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end. It's a false construct.
Mm.
The subtle teachings on emptiness are higher states of perception in the Mahamudra or Dzogchen. You know, they're advanced states of realization of the unity of presence, right? They're not a comment on how you're supposed to cope with day-to-day life, whether it's worth having a job or trying to get a better job or trying to improve your life experience. It's a false comparison. It's a confusion of levels, basically.
Ah, that's really good. That's really good. Thank you for that. I'll have to re-listen to what you just said, but that's really good. It's a confusion of levels, and those kind of teachings are not necessarily a comment on how you cope with everyday life.
Exactly. You have to realize that teachings are pointing to the ultimate non-dual origin of the presence or of truth, are pointing to what we could call the high form of the unitive field. Is there a unitive field? I mean, this explains a lot of, I would argue, illusion in the world generally. There is a unitive field, yes, at a very pure point of spiritual participation or insight. You're in this presence that includes everything, and everything is of value. But that is not the regressive unity that we see many steps down from that point, a fantasy about the world that everyone's a good and kind person, that everyone will do this. If you just give them this, it will lead to this. That's a confusion of levels again, misperceiving a spiritual experience, pointing you to the heart of reality, and the fact that, you know, a lot of the time people are not living in the heart of reality.
Mm.
And a lot of time we have to acknowledge in a sobering way that there are many people and many forces in this world that are not good, kind influences.
Mm.
So there is a kind of spiritual maturation that has to occur too, where, because often spiritually inclined people are very good, kind, sensitive people, but it can come with this kind of naivete that becomes very harmful.
For sure. For sure. We are two Pisces speaking together, right?
Yeah, we are. You can feel it, can't you,
I
in the
can feel
background?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah, it's been a pleasure. You know, you're a very thoughtful person, and I knew that the moment I read your suggestions about 20 minutes before this conversation started, and I thought, wow, I'm gonna have to sit up straight here and yeah, pay some attention. I had to look at my own book to remind myself of a couple of things. So it's been a genuine pleasure. I hope we can do it again. And
I would love to. I would love
yeah,
to. And I just want to really recommend your book. It's really brilliant, and there's so many. You call it the bibliography, but not
yes,
bibliography. But for this book, personally, I've decided I want to go on and read Field, Form, and Fate.
yes, Michael Comforty, yes,
Recommend that?
yes. It's very the section where it looks at client work, you have to recognize he's in a very strict analytical vessel, right? So that might not apply to your work, but yes, his reflections are very powerful, and he's involved with an institute based in Assisi in Italy. They do some interesting stuff, but yeah, it's an excellent, thoughtful book.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe a concluding thought we can say, you know, because some of this stuff can be very abstract. The field idea
Mm.
is actually enormously and directly personal and practical. And you can begin to realize that a lot of what's presented in human experience as thought, I think this, you know, oh gosh, I need to change my PowerPoint. I woke up at 3 a.m, about to do a major presentation the next day. I need to change my whole PowerPoint. Is that a genuine thought, or is that just the manifestation of anxiety, an emotional field through the action of the mind, right? So once you start to realize that on a more personal level, emotional background fields, states of identification with your own life, they seemingly produce thoughts and actions, but actually, are they real, genuine thoughts? were they really actually considered by a rational entity? So often, so many of our thoughts and words and actions are actually just the spontaneous expression of emotional fields that we're identified with. You know, we think we're being rational, but it's just fear that's gripped us. Yeah.
Sure. So it's all about where it's coming from.
So you have to learn to center, and psychosynthesis has this I self-axis, the central line, if you like. And you have to learn to realize what's coming up in those individual fields so that you're not just swayed in the storm of them.
Yeah, that's a good concluding thought. Thank you so much, Mark Jones. So happy to have you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Take care. Blessings.